Hindu mindset. Dr. Khuram Iqbal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and a very good morning to all of you. Just one correction. I've been introduced by the lady as a 29 years old enthusiastic researcher. That's an old bio lying somewhere in Google. I'm now 36. Enthusiasm still persists. Did my PhD in counter-terrorism studies from Australia, and that's what brought me to this forum. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about terrorism studies, there are two dominant and competing perspectives which divide this discourse. One is called orthodox or traditional terrorism studies, and the second is termed critical terrorism studies. Since I've spent 12 years in the field of terrorism studies, I can tell you with confidence that the first category of scholars following in orthodox or traditional terrorism, they are inherently unlikely to deliberate state terrorism being unleashed from the state of India. There are reasons. Firstly, for orthodox or traditional scholars of terrorism, terrorism by definition means use or threat of use of violence with political agenda by the non-state actors. So by definition, orthodox scholars they omit the use of aggression, no matter how illegitimate it is, from the definition of terrorism. Secondly, historically, orthodox and traditional scholars in terrorism studies, they have been politically biased towards the West and its imperial agenda. In 1979, Noam Chomsky noted that the Western scholars of security studies and terrorism studies, they function ideologically to legitimize the involvement of Western governments in the third world and the developing world to suppress the left-wing movements. So that category of scholars, which is quite dominant, quite influential across the world, especially in the West, including Pakistan, they have always functioned ideologically to support a particular narrative, that is the dominant narrative or the narrative of the powerful. So going back to Chomsky in 1979, if you talk about the Cold War, anything, any idea that challenged the Western hegemony was labeled as radical, extreme, or terrorist. All the left-wing movements in different parts of the world, they were given this label because, of course, they challenged the Western imperial hegemonic mindset and the hegemony as well. So number of non-radicals were termed as radicals, and number of radicals who were actually radicals, they were packaged and presented as resistant groups, as the holy warriors fighting the godless commies. And how can we forget President Reagan meeting the jihadi leaders in Oval Office and terming them as the moral equivalent of the American forefathers who partook in the Civil War. That's how America basically assigned legitimacy to the so-called holy warriors fighting the Soviets during the Cold War. And then you may also recall how the National Security Advisor of the United States of America once visited, I think it was a border on Torkham. He was addressing the local tribesmen there, pointing his finger towards Afghanistan. He advises the tribesmen, the mosques behind those mountains, the homes behind those mountains belong to you. Go reclaim God is on your side. That is how a particular variant of so-called militancy was legitimized by the hegemon. Is that likely to change? I'm afraid not. The scholarship in international relations, security studies, and terrorism studies is as subservient to imperial agenda as it was perhaps during the Cold War. Perhaps after 9/11, the scholarship, the knowledge power nexus has become stronger than ever. There was a mushroom growth of overnight counterterrorism experts after 9/11 who churned out knowledge with a view to legitimize illegal, illegitimate intervention of the West in the Muslim lands. Every day, not every day, after every hour, 6 new books were published on counterterrorism after 9/11, and the only intent was to legitimize what was happening in the Middle East. And most of those so-called interventions, they were not sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. And meanwhile, during this time, the other variants of extremism grew unabated under the watchful eyes of the Western capitals. Far-right extremism, the non-green variant of extremism, the Islamophobes, they continued to grow, and the Western capitals, they continue to focus on jihadist extremism because it supported, it facilitated their geostrategic agenda. In 2017, I'm quoting a report by Europol, Terrorism Trends and Analysis Report, and they said that in 2017, 86% of terrorist attacks in Europe, they were conducted by non-Islamist militants, including the ethno-nationalists, the separatists, and the left wings. But the majority of their strategic resources, they were all dedicated to pursue an imagined enemy. That was the Islamic extremism. And you need to deconstruct as to what drove that knowledge power nexus. Far-right extremism, non-Islamic extremism grew. The scholarship continued to churn out knowledge on so-called Islamic extremism. Again, citing one scholar, a prominent, I would say, the father of critical terrorism studies, Alex P. Schmidt, he surveyed 4,558 peer-reviewed journal articles published from 2001 to 2011 and found that 99.4% of those articles, 99.4% of those so-called knowledge was focused exclusively on Islamic extremism, and only a fraction, 0.6%, focused on the far-right extremism. And I've told you the number of attacks perpetrated by the non-Islamist militants far exceeded the ones conducted by the so-called jihadist extremists, but still, and that was not the case exclusive to the Western capitals. Hum bhi is gunah mein shareek the. Is that likely to change? I'm afraid not. When we talk about saffron terrorism, the state which is now led by a saffron mindset, rather it's a takeover of world's largest democracy by saffron terrorists. They are not likely to attract the Western scholarly or policy attention, mainly because the saffron India has evolved strategic convergence with the West. At the moment, West is only concerned, especially the United States of America, in containing China. Counterterrorism is nowhere to be seen on the global agenda of the United States of America, especially after Donald Trump took office. So when US is obsessed with constructing a threat of China, when US is obsessed with xenophobia, it's willing to look the other way when a world's so-called largest democracy is actually taken over by an organization which was banned in India thrice for its involvement in terrorist activities. That's not likely to change. If we're sitting in Islamabad, we're expecting that Western capitals would come forward criticizing and condemning this variant of extremism. This will never happen. There's a long history of United States of America using proxy groups to settle its geostrategic scores. With the Soviets we have seen, and it's not likely to give up that anytime soon. Only a few months ago, East Turkestan Islamic movement has been delisted from the list of terrorist organizations. So the same guys who were labeled as terrorists after 2001, they have been delisted. Why? Because America wants to contain China, no matter what's the cost, no matter even if they have to use the proxies. So I think it'll be too wishful to expect US and its strategic allies in the West, in Asia, in the Muslim world, to actually criticize the state-sponsored terrorism in India. Well, you might think I'm coming from NDU and, this is just some grudges that I'm expressing against our arch-rival India. Let me offer you an analytical framework which is frequently used by terrorism studies to ascertain the scale of threat by the Hindutva forces. In terrorism studies, we use this adversarial threats analysis framework to gauge whether an entity poses a threat and what is the scale of that threat. There are three components of adversarial analysis threats framework. First is intentions, second is capabilities, and third, opportunities. Intentions of an extremist organizations are usually gauged through three things. Number one, their ideological manuals. Number two, statements and interviews of extremist leaders. Number three, history of involvement of the terrorist organizations. The second component is capability. We gauge capability of extremist organizations by looking at the numbers of members, the quality of training imparted to those members, the type of weapons available to them, the finances, and few other indicators. Then the third is opportunity. Whether an extremist organization with intentions and capabilities has the opportunity to grow and implement its agenda, and we gauge opportunities by the level of public support that an extremist organizations enjoy in a given country. So now use these three indicators and see whether RSS and its allies pose a threat to South Asian regional security or not. Well, I would argue that a saffronized nuclear India is an existential threat to South Asian regional security. And I do so by using these three indicators. Intentions, look at the ideology. The apologists of Hindutva, they argue, Hindutva, they might be nationalists, but they are averse to violence. Well, one just needs to read Savarkar's Who is Hindu in 1923. Savarkar openly endorsed the use of violence in pursuit of Akhand Bharat, the greater Bharat. Not only ideologically endorsed, but during the Second World War, Savarkar evolved a convergence with the British colonial regime, and on the request of the British Empire, he sent thousands of RSS members to take part in the Second World War. And he wanted to achieve two main goals. First, he wanted to, of course, have cordial relations with the imperial power. And second, he wanted the RSS members to have the first-hand experience, so they would be battle-hardened and they would be quite handy in achieving the Akhand Bharat through use of force. So violence is there in the ideology of Hindutva. You just need to read the number of books which have been published by RSS ideologues. The second objection that the apologists of Hindutva, they argue that, well, like Al-Qaeda, Daesh, Hindutva forces are not transnational, they are not expansionist, they are quite nationalistic in their approach. Is that so? Just look at the RSS official website, which carries the map of Akhand Bharat, including countries from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. This is what RSS basically stands for today. And you still call it a localized agenda? You still call it a localized phenomena? Then I doubt your objectivity. So they are prone to violence, They are expansionist, and their target selection does not only include Muslims, but Christians and scheduled caste Hindus as well. As Ambassador Jalani has rightly mentioned, Hindutva by default is a Brahman phenomena. It's a way of Brahmins to ensure their elite status within the hierarchy, and of course scheduled caste and other low caste Hindus are being used for that. So we have seen Hindutva forces targeting not only Muslims, but there have been a number of incidents where Christians have been targeted. It's just a matter of time when Hindutva forces, they start targeting Christians, because Christians are as, वो एक लफ्ज इस्तेमाल करते हैं, alien to India as Muslims are. Because according to Hindutva ideology, it's only the Hindus, Sikhs, Jains who are the sons of the soil, and Christians and Muslims, they are the invaders. I can tell from this forum to the Western capitals, it's a matter of time before Hindutva forces turn their guns to Christians in India. And I think at that time, the West would certainly react. So looking at capabilities, I told you capabilities are gauged by the number of members and fighters affiliated with Sangh Parivar, RSS. The total membership of RSS within India at the moment exceeds 6 million at the moment. That's the official membership. The number of so-called Hindu seminaries working under the umbrella of RSS, it exceeds 28,000. And what is being taught in those madaris, Hindu madaris, or Hindu seminaries, is of course use of weapons from daggers to firearms, and indoctrination based on an ideology which is exclusive, which is divisive. And the thing goes on. Then training schools that Sangh Parivar has established. And the most important training school when we talk about militancy led to saffron extremism is Bhonsle Military Academy, which, for your kind information, was inaugurated by a British officer in pre-partition India. So why Britishers supported Hindutva, it's another matter of course, debate, but of course we can talk about in Q&A session if you want. So that academy where Colonel Prohit, who was involved in Samjhauta train blast, which killed 55 Pakistanis on Indian soil, which was initially blamed on Pakistan, और जिसको बुनियाद बना के हिंदुस्तान ने bilateral process को scuttle किया था, and number of apologists within Pakistan, they started blaming Pakistan for Samjhauta train blast, and later it was discovered that it was basically Abhinav Bharat, of a breakaway group attached to Sangh Parivar, led by a serving colonel of Indian Army. You would find number of training camps across Uttar Pradesh, which are now imparting this military training to RSS and Sangh Parivar members. UP will emerge as the epicenter of Hindu terrorism in a decade or so. And there are reasons why UP will serve as the epicenter of Hindu terrorism. But these camps are mainly located in UP. And then, there are separate camps for women, there are separate camps for youth. You just need to search online, go through the scholarly products that are being now, thankfully, emerging from Pakistan and West, of course. When I say West, it's the Europe. Europeans now are dedicating sufficient amount of scholarship to study Hindutva and far-right extremism. There are centers in Netherlands, there are centers in Norway, there are centers in Australia, which are now dedicated to study Hindutva and far-right extremism. I've been just given this chat 5 more minutes, so I'll just rush. Opportunities. One important indicator of conducive environment for any extremist to grow is the popular support enjoyed by the militant or the extremist outfit. Can we deny BJP has won elections with thumping majority? I often tell my class that, in Pakistan, we need not to be worried too much about the so-called radicalism and extremism. We have never voted extremists in the parliament. They have always been limited to the streets. But in India, in world's largest democracy, BJP, which is the political wing of Sangh Parivar, won 2 consecutive elections and with thumping majority. So today, not only the streets, but Parliament of India It's also led by Hindutva forces. Look at the composition of Modi, his composition of his cabinet. 9 out of 19 members, they had RSS background. And it has not changed drastically. Hindutva in India has been institutionalized to a level where it is irreversible. At the moment, state is not involved in terrorism in the classic sense, or as per the classic definition of terrorism. Why? There's no need to involve in terrorism. Terrorism, by definition, is a weapon of weak. Terrorists in India, they have captured the state. Why do they need to resort to violence? They are using legal means to pursue their agenda. Look at Kashmir. Look at the legislation to discourage so-called love jihad. Look at the other parts of legislation that they have done. So when they have the legal tool, when they have the entire state organs in Keremo Karampet, why would they involve in terrorism? They will, when they will lose power. As someone has said, it's not power which makes you vulnerable to violence. It's the fear of losing power that makes you vulnerable to violence. The day when BJP is kicked out of the Parliament of India by Congress or whosoever, you would see how RSS would go on a rampage. And this terrorism would be unprecedented in the history of mankind, not only South Asia. At that time, all those will be held accountable who looked the other way when this monster was raising its ugly head. Thank you very much.